So let me begin with a proposition. Together, we are a family. This advertisement, which I'm sure you've actually all seen, for a Bank of Palestine savings scheme, includes a picture of 2 adults and 3 children. We assume this group constitutes a family because the caption states this implicitly. There's a physical resemblance between the people, and the people also embody the statistical average nuclear family size for the West Bank and Beirut particularly, which is just over 5. Furthermore, I would argue this image embodies an increasingly common, one is tempted to almost say normative, aspiration for what is thought about usually as a small family, certainly in the Musharat. But looking carefully at the advert reveals a 6th family member. Because as you can see, the speech bubble comes not from the family, but encapsulates them. They are captured by it, captured by the speech of another. While it's not unambiguously clear who this other is, I think we are clearly meant to think that it is the Bank of Palestine itself. In other words, we are encouraged to think that this other is precisely not other to the family subject. Together, we are a family. Mother, father, children, bank. What does it mean for the Bank of Palestine to be part of the family, or any other bank in Palestine for that matter? In my ongoing research project, Family and Cities and Everyday Geography of Ramallah, this is one of the questions I've been trying to address. And I'm not the only one asking such a question. Journalists such as Amira Hass and Dalia Hakuta have written feature-length articles about the growing role of banks in Palestinian everyday life. The reason that banks have become an object of concern in both an intellectual and more prosaic sense is because Palestinians in the occupied territories, and specifically in the West Bank, have been borrowing more and more money from them. Palestinian Monetary Authority statistics tell us that in 2013, the Palestinian Authority owed almost $2.4 billion to various others, of which $1.25 billion was owed to banks in Palestine. Meanwhile, in the same year, Palestinian consumers were indebted to the tune of $403 million for housing loans, $103 million for vehicle financing, and $885 million for consumption loans, giving a grand total of $1.391 billion. This figure represents an almost 6-fold increase since 2008. Although it's also worth noting that the rate of increase was greatest between 2009 and 2012, and slowed considerably last year in 2013. In my talk today, I'll think about how we might understand debt and thus the nature of a particular present in Palestine, although we should say the West Bank, and even more precisely Ramallah, or the Ramallah governor, since the Palestinian Monetary Authority figures show that 2/3 of all private credit facilities are held in Ramallah. So Ramallah is the big Pac-Man, as you can see, the text isn't clear. I will first suggest that debt is a form of governance, and second, that it is one of many ways in which we owe things to others, or people owe things to others. This second approach means thinking theoretically about financial debt in relation to extensive practices of social obligation, and paying more attention empirically to actual experiences of living with debt. As we shall see in conclusion, financially indebted subjects are frequently worn down and worn out However, amidst such scenes of exhaustion and endurance, discourses and practices that exceed, undercut, and work against financial indebtedness come into view. So, Section 1, Debt as Governance. Debt has received a great deal of attention globally, not least because the massive financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 became, after the US and European states bailed out their banks, characterised as one of excessive state borrowing, or what is commonly termed a sovereign debt crisis. While a common sense understanding of the term debt conjures an image of an economic relation between two parties, both long-standing and more recent scholarship suggests something more complex. For instance, Lazarattu understands debt as a means of governance, a way of acting on the actions of others. The aim, he suggests, is to minimise the uncertainty of the time and behaviour of the governed, to ensure people honour their debts or pay their debts. They are at once encouraged and compelled to become the entrepreneurs of their own lives. That is, individuals who are responsible for creating their own future. Lazarattu suggests that systems of debt are the fundamental social relation structuring contemporary capitalism. My colleague at Durham, Paul Langley, builds on these claims by suggesting that after the 2007-9 financial crisis, although sovereign debt has been thought about as destructive and dangerous, and thus needs to be paid back or pared down, debt in general is still considered productive. It's seen as a means through which publics can secure houses, cars, education, in short, their very lives. Lazarattu's approach has much to offer understandings of contemporary Palestine, I think. As both Hass and Hakuta suggest, debt-fueled consumption is actively promoted by a range of institutions as a kind of economic peace initiative, a form of pacification that replaces political struggles for national liberation with the promise of a good life defined by capitalism. And there's also a temporal aspect, so a certain future is traded for a certain present. At the same time, the necessity to borrow from the future is created through the production of an eviscerated present. The consumption-fueled approach to economic development that is at the root of debt as a governance strategy in the occupied territories therefore fits squarely alongside the myriad of ways in which the Israeli occupation materially impoverishes Palestinians and prevents Palestinian productive capacity through a range of processes, including building restrictions, lack of border controls, movement restrictions on goods and people, etc., etc. I think you're familiar with these. Efforts to govern Palestinians in this way, which is to say, to mitigate or circumvent the effects of occupation by promoting economic development, are not new. Neve Gordon, for instance, documents similar processes implemented in the late 60s and 1970s. However, current processes differ in that they emerge as a legacy of the Oslo Accords and the specific geography and style of colonial governance that the Accords instantiated, which is to say an assemblage that now includes the Palestinian Authority, international donors and NGOs alongside Israel. Thus, the policies associated with Salam Fayyad's appointment as Prime Minister in 2007, including various ways in which Palestinian banks have been encouraged to loan more money, provided renewed impetus to a series of strategies that has a longer genealogy. Section 2, debt as moral logic of exchange. Can broaden this understanding of debt further by turning to the work of anthropologist David Graeber. Graeber's argument is that debt can be understood as an obligation that's quantified using money. Obligation quantified using money. In the historical comparison he offers, societies using what anthropologists term primitive money have done so to create, maintain, and reorganize relations between people, or what he terms human economies. In effect, money in these contexts is an acknowledgement that debts can never be paid. Money cannot count or account for life, since debt debt is society itself. The social relations are society. By contrast, commercial economies that are organised around coinage and wealth creation are relatively new. Now, founded on violence, usually slavery, which rips people from their social context and enables the equation of money and life. Graeber argues contemporary understandings of debt are dominated by a specific moral logic of economic relations. This is the logic of exchange, where two parties who are formally speaking equals freely enter into an agreement. Such a logic implies not only formal equality, but also a liberal understanding of subjectivity as autonomous and sovereign. Or put more simply, people who exchange things are separate as well as equal. Graeber positions the logic of exchange alongside two other logics that organise human relations, which he terms communism and hierarchy. Communism is characterised by the axiom from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. So when a passerby asks for directions or a colleague asks you to pass a pen, and you do so probably without thinking and certainly without expecting payment, these are forms of communism. You give because you have, you take because you need. For Graeber, social life relies on a baseline communism. It relies on these sorts of relations to work. Hierarchy, by contrast, works according to the logic of precedent, custom, or habit. In such relations, two or more parties are formally distinct, like the human and the divine, or the king or the prince and his subjects. Consequently, relations take forms such as tribute or sacrifice, since what can one give the sovereign, whether divine or profane, who already has everything? Graeber's argument is that all of these moral logics, communism, hierarchy, and exchange, are present in all economic systems to different degrees. Currently, logics of exchange dominate. While it's possible, as critics of his work have done, to question Graeber's sweeping history and his invocation of a romantic discourse of community, I find his work useful for thinking about debt in relation to broader questions about what we owe others. Therefore, in order to better understand the current growth of bank debt in Palestine, I want to relocate these conceptual themes to the context of Ramallah. Let me preface this discussion with a brief introduction to the empirical research I've been doing. So, Section 3, debt in the context of Umm-Sharait. Last year, two research assistants, both of whom actually graduated with masters from the MA in Gender and Development here. And I conducted a series of repeat interviews with 25 families and individuals who all reside in the Albeira neighbourhood of Sharait. 24 of the 25 participants also filled in daily financial diaries. While the interviews examined a number of aspects of contemporary life, nearly all participants had been or are financially indebted. Participants reported taking loans to buy houses, but more commonly apartments, cars for medical expenses, for wedding expenses, to furnish or renovate their home, to improve a private business, for daily expenses and for travel expenses. However, although holding debt in Sharait is common, the creditor to whom money is owed can be quite diverse. Loans have been taken from banks, but also from family members, friends, work colleagues, from employers in the form of salary advances or via company loan schemes, from traders in the form of post-dated cheques, and from building owners in the form of instalment payments for apartments. Given the prevalence of credit-debt relations, it might be possible to think about the materiality of a neighbourhood like Sharait, or even the city of Ramallah more broadly, its housing, cars, consumer goods, and even less obviously its medical facilities, its schools, as a landscape of debt. This concept would help to bring to the fore the ways in which all these things rely on debt for their purchase and consumption, even as landscapes such as Sharait are, of course, constituted by many more factors and forces. However, conceptually speaking, topographic landscapes, such as the ones I've described, do not embody debt exactly, because debt is an inherently topological space. It is a means by which subjects are bound to others in ways that are maintained regardless of topographic transformations and deformations. So imagine a bit of string that connects you to a bank or a relative and remains attached to you wherever you go. Debt is precisely this bit of string, which is to say the relation between debtor and creditor. Such a relation is very real, but of course our imaginary bit of string would never work in reality in some ways. It would break, for instance, as soon as you closed a door, or it would just become so tangled we couldn't move. So while the Bank of Palestine does not literally move into a family's mortgaged home, as we will see, they can become part of a set of relations we might call family. To clarify, what I am arguing is that debt is a relational space that doesn't, formally speaking, possess a tangible materiality, but topologies of debt, nevertheless, do become embedded in and are constituted by topographic landscapes. That's the last bit of geography theory, so don't worry. It's all up from here. It's also important to note that relationships of indebtedness are not simply the providence of humans. We might, for instance, think about how Ramallah itself, beyond its residents, is a heavily indebted city. Here I'm not referring to the financial health of the municipalities, nor to the fact that the majority of all private consumer credit is held in Ramallah, 2/3 as we saw earlier. Rather, to think Ramallah as indebted topologically means thinking about how it's connected to other places. For example, what it owes donors and diaspora in terms of money, other parts of the West Bank and the 48 territories in terms of the people who constitute its workforce, residents and consumers, and a vast array of places within and beyond the Arab world in terms of its imaginaries about what constitutes contemporary urban life, or what should constitute contemporary urban life. However, in this talk, I'm interested in the ways in which debt becomes embedded in the social practices and intimate spaces of everyday life, like our family from the beginning of the talk. That is mother, father, children, bank. It's not only the Bank of Palestine who thinks about the intimacy of family life in this way. Take these accounts from our empirical research. Mohammed told us, the bank takes 40% of my salary. That means $700, so that means $1,050 remains, and I have bills, so $800 remains, and I have to pay $300 to the credit card, so $500 remain. So how can I pay for the schools and everything else? I rescheduled the loan. All my life is pledged to the bank. Abu Omar told us, a friend of mine took a big loan to get married, buy a house and buy a car. I told him if he was not able to repay the loan that he took to marry, the bank will take his wife back. Some people say this is one of the good things about debt. Ibn Ghassan told us, the loan is like one of the family members. It eats and drinks with me, and it sleeps and wakes up with us. It's like a nightmare. We can see in these accounts that, as Graeber argues, the dominance of logics of exchange, upon which contemporary relations of indebtedness are built, enable life to be given a monetary value. In Abu Omar's story, his friend's wife acquires an exchange value, or at least that's the joke. The valuation of life itself, and more specifically the attempt to extract surplus value from life, has been characterised by scholars such as Melinda Cooper as specific to neoliberal forms of capitalism. However, it's also important to note that in the final quotation, debt becomes part of the family, suggesting that in a sense, capitalist value can also be given life. What might we surmise from this moment when debt is incorporated within the family? In other words, what might we think when capitalist value is given life, as at the same time life is given capitalist value? On the one hand, the insertion of debt as a family member implies penetration, a kind of military takeover model, to paraphrase Iwa Ong. Capital triumphs. It's quite simply a nightmare. However, I want to suggest that stopping here risks rendering simplistic what are more complex lives and social practices in a manner that mimics the abstractions of capitalism itself. Rather, we might think about the way Ibn Ghassan brings debt to life as a family member as simultaneously transforming, or at least seeking to transform, capitalist value. To explore this contention further, I want to examine financial indebtedness in relation to practices of social obligation or social duties. This manoeuvre is part of thinking about debt in a broader context of what we owe others. So, section 4, obligations. The range of practices that participants in our study described as duties or social commitments is both numerous and diverse. They can be roughly summarised as caring for and supporting relatives, particularly parents, siblings and children, through a variety of activities, including providing housing, providing for daily consumption, health, education, and assisting with life course transitions. Duties also include visiting and celebrating with the social occasions of both relatives and colleagues and friends. I'd include mourning events in this sort of category. And also observing and maintaining moral and religious values. And in one case, providing free medical treatment for extended family members when visiting a village of origin. Although such practices are usually referred to as social duties, they are also at the same time financial, cultural, and religious. In the present moment, many practices of obligation lie ambiguously between a logic of exchange and a logic of communism. Let us take the wedding as an example. The giving of gifts to the bride and the groom can be understood as a means by which a social collective channels goods and resources to those who need them at the point in their life course when they need them, or in other words, a relation of communism. However, marriage has become much more commercialised, nowhere more so perhaps than with Sharia, which is full of wedding halls, as you probably know. And thus this commercialisation has contributed, in probably in large part, I'd have thought, to weddings becoming much more expensive. One of the effects of this is it demands that young men who must pay for their weddings with or without family support either work longer to save the required money, or, like Abu Omar's friend, borrow money and pay it back later. So financial debt becomes one solution to a problem of social reproduction in this context. However, staging weddings remains a relatively infrequent event in the kind of life course of families. But attending weddings is common practice for many of the participants in our study. Often participants would attend multiple weddings each weekend in the summer. Hence, attending weddings can amount to a significant expense too, particularly if it involves travelling long distances, buying new clothes, and above all because guests are obliged to contribute a cash gift to the couple, or gold in the case of close relatives in some cases. While gift giving is ostensibly a male responsibility, this may be distributed through the family as other family members contribute their incomes to a collective family pot or pool. Even our sixth family member, debt, may make a contribution in some circumstances. So earlier I had a quote from Muhammad, and one of the major expenses at the time of his research was his sister's wedding in Nablus. And one of the ways he met the expenses for that wedding was through a consumption loan. However, in talking with residents of Sharait, debt repayment more often prevented, albeit indirectly, rather than enabled the fulfilment of social commitments. Abu Samir told us, last week 2 of my friends got married. I was able to go to one of my friend's weddings because I was not busy and I had the money needed to give him a financial gift. The second friend is one of my best friends, but I was not able to go to his wedding. I didn't have the money to give him. Rami told us 2 of our relatives in Bethlehem got married last week. We were able to attend one of the weddings because transportation was available. My uncle rented a bus for the relatives who live in Ramallah, so it was free. However, we couldn't attend the other wedding. There was no free transportation and we didn't have enough money to go. We needed more than 800 shekels to give to the groom. We discussed attending this wedding as a family and we decided not to go. Finally, Imran again. My eldest son's friend came to his wedding and gave him a financial gift. And when he got married, we were not able to go. We just apologised and went to greet him later, or a long time later. My son's friend gave him 300 shekels as a gift on his wedding day. It was hard to avoid this social obligation. When we were able to go, we took a good gift and a financial gift too. In addition to the sense of the attrition of social life that these quotes suggest, there are a couple of points to note that may help develop my analysis of obligations and their relationship with financial debt. First, Abu Samir and Ibn Ghassan's stories suggest that it is not simply a case of money replacing social ties. What these two stories suggest is that money becomes a direct proxy or measure of social relations, such that one must give more money to one's closest family members and friends, precisely because money acts as a barometer for this social proximity. Everyone is not formally equal. Social proximity creates differences which are then given a value. So it's less true to say that Ghassan's friendship cost 300 shekels, and more precise to suggest that because of his close friendship, 300 shekels was given. One of the perverse consequences of this state of affairs is that it becomes easier, which is to say cheaper, to go to the social events of people you know less well. But of course you're more obligated to go to the events of close family and friends. And in most cases participants suggested it's the events of close family and friends that are prioritised. Second, I suggested earlier that behind the promotion of debt-fueled consumption lies a promise of a better present, which also functions as a means of circumventing and closing down a particular future of post-colonial national liberation, if you like. Here, Ibn Ghassan highlights an extension of this temporality within the context of intimate social life. Rather than the promised good life, debt experienced in the present tense is an obligation to pay up now. And this in turn forces the sacrifice or deferment of other forms of life that have little or no value under capitalism to the future. So the context for Ibn Ghassan's story is that the family must defer their social commitment to a future date because they must repay 4 consumption loans taken from the bank. And must here is perhaps not a strong enough word, since the bank deducts loan repayments directly from Abu Ghassan's salary when it's deposited. So one cannot choose not to repay. The decision is already taken, placed in an inaccessible past tense, in the moment when the loan was agreed. Thus, the mechanism of debt through which social life becomes bound to the bank, or banks in general, also closes down a particular present, which is to say a present where subjects have the ability to not be in debt. Debt is, if you like, a door that you can only go through once. Given these complex temporal entanglements, it's no wonder that, as one participant suggested, quite simply, we are slaves. However, I also argued earlier that reducing social life to capitalist value was simplistic and reductive. What evidence is there to support this claim? Certainly, if we continue to think about non-attendance at social obligations, this often happens because of a range of factors, only some of which we might link with debt. So other reasons given by participants for not attending social occasions include not having enough time, often because of other social commitments, work, being ill, or simply not wanting to go. However, some participants suggested it was simply not possible to miss social occasions because of the risks of social isolation or ostracism. So we asked Ziad, is it possible to miss social obligations? And he said, no, never. He said, no, I can't. It's very difficult, impossible. So I asked him again, if you got invited to a social obligation and you didn't want to go, how can you avoid it if you wanted to? And Ziad told us, I don't have an answer for this question. And if you have a solution or good justification, tell me. It's hard to think of justifications, and I can't avoid any of the social obligations. Similarly, Ali said, for me, no, it's not easy to avoid social events. I don't have a choice. There are many aspects obliging me to go. It's not only religion, it's also traditions, relatives, friends. I don't live in an isolated society. It's not easy at all. Finally, Abu Mahmoud told us, I never try to miss an obligation unless I'm ill. I don't think so. Even if I don't like the person, if he invites me, I have to go. I've never tried to escape as long as I've been invited, even if we've never had events in common before. For these particular participants more than others, it literally did seem almost unthinkable to miss social occasions. If dominant forms of power knowledge shape what is thinkable and what is sayable, then I take this unthinkability to indicate the continued relevance and importance of a set of discourses whose values are not capitalist in origin, nor does capitalist value map onto such discourses and practices in any straightforward manner, which is not to say that they are unrelated, of course. To return to my broader argument, what I'm suggesting is that in Ramallah we are not witnessing a straightforward move from communism to exchange in Graeber's terms, even as quite clearly logics of exchange have become much more prominent. Rather, I think the multiple ways in which residents of Sharait owe things to others creates a space of social, which is to say political contestation, if we understand politics here to be about the ways in which people sort of work through and work out the problems of living together, so sort of small p politics. This space of contestation is dynamic and changing, but it would be wrong to assume that there's some sort of teleological endpoint. Another way of putting this is that we can neither point to nor expect a neoliberal takeover nor a neoliberal landscape, even as what Collier terms neoliberalism as a form of critical reflection on governmental practice, a kind of double movement of critique on the one hand and programming or reprogramming on the other hand, has been deployed. But as Collier also points to in his work, the governmental assemblage, or what we might say the current state of affairs in Ramallah, that emerges from this process of critique programming, is a complex edifice. So put contextually, Israeli and PA officials and the international donor states who in various ways are promoting debt-fueled consumption clearly have a very great capacity to act. However, residents of Sharait also shape the current state of affairs by circulating ideas about the enduring importance of social ties and obligations. In conclusion, I want to specify some of these discourses in relation to the problem of thinking about debt as a source of harm. So, final section, debt as harm. Earlier in the paper I hinted at, rather than explicitly stated, the fact that growing indebtedness to banks was harmful for social life, or detrimental for social life. However, citing, specifically identifying indebtedness as a source of harm can prove to be a challenging task. What we might call causes are diffuse and therefore easy to dismiss. For example, most participants suggested they were forced by circumstances to become indebted. Nevertheless, some participants stated that ultimately people choose to take loans, almost as if of their own free will. And thus any suffering becomes a personal responsibility and an index of someone's own imprudence. In this account, any harm resulting from debt is self-inflicted and cannot be excused by broader contextual processes or factors. So it's someone's own fault. Ties in with what Lazaratu says about neoliberalism. It's an individual's responsibility to make their own future, and the burden of failure is also theirs. It's also difficult to identify harm itself, because as an everyday lived experience, financial debt is chronic rather than periodic, by which I mean it's ongoing, it's durative, rather than kind of punctual and eventful. Consequently, it's hard to point to a moment of harm, since debt is precisely not momentary. It doesn't work according to that temporality. Similarly, I've suggested that debt's spatiality is topological rather than topographic, and thus it's hard to locate in a particular space, or at least a particular topographic space. So debt's violence is thus the hardly eventful wearing down and wearing away of life, which we might think about in relation to the term slow death. Laurent Ballant defines slow death as, quote, the physical wearing out of a population in a way that points to its deterioration as a defining condition of its experience and historical existence. While this could very well capture the experience of living or the experience of life amidst colonial occupation in general, one would have to see like the colonial sovereign, and I think only like the colonial sovereign, to suggest that this was the defining feature of a population. Nevertheless, I think Ballant's concept is useful for capturing the almost imperceptible ways in which some people, kind of specific populations, if you like, face heightened exposure to forms of harm. In our empirical research, this has been most apparent in a great deal of talk about being busy all the time, not having enough time, and feeling tired. Daily life becomes a form of attrition, slowly wearing people out and wearing them down. Responding to daily life as a form of attrition is challenging, precisely because debt's harm is attritional. The language of crisis and the response it anticipates will not necessarily be effective. Wearing away is not the same as a spectacular form of destruction. As I have suggested, what we might think of as causes, or what we might call causes, are diffuse and therefore easy to dismiss within modes of crisis talk. However, I think there are resources at hand, imminent solutions, if you like, for creating avenues out of this impasse. And in particular, I want to talk up the values embodied within existing discourses that residents offer as an alternative or an otherwise to life with bank debt. In my research, I think there are at least 4 ways in which this otherwise was described. The first is through what I want to term gestures of excess. So Walid told us social obligations are the basic obligations, and financial obligations are just a means to facilitate social life. Such a discourse is excessive precisely because it refuses to live according to a particular set of values that posits money as the basis of social life. Such a gesture is easy to naively romanticize, and it may only be possible in contexts where someone's financial situation is relatively good. Were it not so, there are many potential costs associated with such a position. So at the most extreme, housing might be repossessed because one attends a wedding. However, it remains one route beyond capitalist value. The second way in which an otherwise can be crafted is through gestures of what I've termed austerity. So Rami told us, my financial status is different from the status of others, and thus what I need is not like what others need. It's not important for me to possess everything that my friend or neighbour owns. I guess satisfaction with your personal financial situation is an important aspect in this process of acclimatisation. Loans provide temporary luxury. Austerity here is a deliberate decision not to participate in a life governed by exchange value, or to enact a particular style of living. While such a response may be simply the result of a poverty of credit as much as a poverty of resources, we can read the reference to loans as illusory as a mode of critique. However, there remains the danger, of course, that an austere response prevents participation in human economies. The third otherwise is improvisation, a term I use to describe the unexpected, unusual, and/or unintended ways in which existing social and material resources are put to use in the manner of Graeber's communism. Think, for instance, of the wedding party held in a street, or a wedding lunch held in the parking garage of a 10-storey apartment building. Improvisation in these contexts involves using the resources of the city in a manner that prioritises use over exchange value, also implicitly posing the question, what does the city owe us, its residents? Fourth and finally, there is social work, a term I deploy to capture the activities that seek to make and remake the social contra financial durable. Consider, for instance, Rami's following suggestion. People can search for other options. I can make an agreement with some traders to buy what I want by using non-bank payments, such as bills of exchange. While it might be argued that in this particular instance Rami is simply drawing on an enduring historical context rather than producing new relations, the potential for working up new social connections that can replace financial ties with banks exists nonetheless. There are undoubtedly many more of these discourses and the practices they emerge from and feed into. If they seem improbable in the face of the power of the PA businessman donor consensus, then perhaps this too provides an index of how far particular ideas about credit, debt, and other obligations have become embedded. However, it's worth remembering in closing that while the indigenous might be consigned to the waiting room of history, as Chakrabarty has it, life goes on there. As Elizabeth Povinelli reminds us, quote, the social worlds of the impractical and the disagreeable remain in durative time. They persist, they do not persist in the abstract. Put another way, while living with debt might be seen as a limbo from the perspective of dominant worlds, those who live in such a situation are, through necessity, problem solvers, constantly working away at how to endure and move beyond such conditions. Thank you very much for your attention.